Turn off the lights. Wear your headphones. Welcome to the Dark Story. The first thing Jonah noticed was the way the light refused to lie. It did not flicker or dim. Those were honest mortal failures, but instead bent at the edges of rooms as if it were being watched and politely chose not to reveal everything. He woke to that quality every morning in the rental above the dry cleaners. A thin, patient daylight that pulled in corners and left other corners deliberately blank. The empty spaces felt chosen. They felt like waiting. Jonah had taken the apartment because it was cheap, and because moving across town felt like moving away from the parts of himself that knew how to hurt. He taught middle school history, came home with classroom dust in his hair, and learned to fix a kettle with patience he didn't have for himself. The building smelled of laundry soap, boiled starch, and the faint metallic tang of rainwater that had seeped through the roof on a slow February. The neighbors were polite in an absentee way. Heads down, packages accepted, elevators opened for them, and closed the world out. On his second week, while he was making tea, he saw them. Shadows that did not belong to any object in the room. They stood along the kitchen wall like listeners at a choir practice. They had the wrong angle, the shape of shoulders without a body attached, heads slightly too large, edges that feathered and did not touch the floor. When the kettle whistled, they did not blur. They leaned in. He told himself it was fatigue or a trick of the early sun through the alley, but he felt them like a weight on his skin, like the cool edge of a hand tracing his spine. He tried to speak of it to Mira, his upstairs neighbor, because some things are easier in the currency of shared notice. "They watch me," he said, holding the mug like a talisman. Mira laughed too softly. "Everything watches, Jonah. Your phone even watches." "Are they tall, short, friendly?" "Not friendly," Jonah said. "They look as if they're listening to the wrong part of a conversation." She offered him sympathy and a biscuit and changed the subject to the landlord's tendency to fix once a month and forget where he started. Jonah left feeling his words had labeled something ephemeral, as if he'd trapped smoke with a name. The shadows changed when she left the room. His relief was pure and immediate. He had expected them to stay, like a lingering smell. They did not vanish when he turned on the television, which normally dissolved the edges of late-night thoughts. They stood along the far wall, patient as ushers. When he spoke aloud, "What do you want?" the reply was not a voice, but the sound of the radiator sighing, a long, human-adjacent breath. The answer slid under the door like cold water. He tried to record them. He set his phone on the counter and filmed the wall for 20 minutes. The footage showed an empty room and a flicker of pixels where in person a shoulder arc should have been. When he played it back with headphones, the audio had a faint layer he hadn't noticed. The murmur of many small voices, like a radio between stations or an argument underwater. At the end of the clip, as if embarrassed, the recording made one note, a clean, deliberate knock from inside the wall. Over the next days, the apartment learned speech. It started small. The fridge clicked twice, like someone impatiently tapping a table. The light in the hallway pulsed in the rhythm of Jonah's childhood nickname. He found footprints on the dust of the windowsill, 3 small prints, like the soles of a child's shoes, though no child had lived in the building for years. A scent began to move through the rooms at dusk, wet earth and orange peel, and a bitter old perfume that flickered memory awake in him. His mother's cologne and a funeral parlor sprayed into mourning. The second week, while grading essays, Jonah found a note on the windowsill written in a child's block letters, "Stay." He had not written it. The handwriting trembled like a hand with a fever. He put the note in his pocket and took it to the laundromat across the street. To Mira, to anyone with a face willing to meet his. People exchanged looks and offered theories. Rats, kids, pranks. The owner of the dry cleaners, a large man with a chest like a savings account, told him flatly, "Walls have ears, Mr. Lane. Walls like to keep what comes in." The shadows reacted when he tried to ignore them. They smoothed like silk over the plaster and leaned closer whenever he attempted to sleep. Once, in the dim that hangs just before dawn, he woke to the smell of smoke and the precise impression of fingers on his wrist, as if someone had jammed a living hand through cotton sleeves. He found no marks, only a bruise of memory. He began to keep lights burning, to sleep in the chair with a blanket and a copy of some book that smelled of dust. As if reading could anger him, the shadows watched him read. The first twist came on a Tuesday when he found an old photograph taped to his bathroom mirror. It showed him as a child, face grubby, knees scabbed, a grin too earnest for a portrait. Something had been written on the back, a single line in a hand he recognized in an ache of familiarity. "You left me at the park." Jonah could not remember ever leaving a child at the park. He believed in the sanctity of his memory in the way adults rely on the ledger of their own lives. The phrase lodged in him like a pebble in a shoe, an irritation that forced new awareness. He confronted his mother over the phone, her voice cracked with cautious offense and something he could not name. "Jonah, you were always forgetful. You wandered. You chased trains." She said it like a truth and like a warning. The conversation felt like a key in a lock he hadn't known had turned. He thought of an afternoon years ago, a park he had visited with a boy he had watched, but not saved. His memory reconstructing itself in that moment was not generous. It was a cracked projection, half-lit and suspect. The apartment escalated as if tuned to the new fuel of his uncertainty. The shadows began to arrange themselves across the rooms in patterns that suggested attention. Rows, circles, angles that echoed the angles of his childhood fear. They formed a doorway at the edge of the hallway where no doorway had been, a seam in the plaster folding into a mouth. When he walked past it, he felt like a trespasser through his own life. He found, taped beneath his mattress, a series of sketches, outlines of people with their eyes erased. Under each outline, a date and a name he recognized. Teachers, classmates, neighbors, everyone whose absence in his life had been small and precise. Each name had a check mark. The second twist arrived quieter and colder. One night, Jonah dreamed he was in the park again and woke with a child's hand in his. He opened his eyes to see a silhouette seated across from him in the dim light, a small shadow like a child's lap, precise and waiting. He spoke and the silhouette nodded. It mimicked him, his small gestures, the way his mouth shaped vowels. "Are you here because I left you?" he asked the void, and the voice that answered was his own, but younger, and the way it said his name, Jonah, was an accusation and a greeting. "You left me," it said. "You made them." Made them. The idea sat like an accusation. If he had left something, someone, then the shadows were the consequence, the echo. If the shadows watched, perhaps it was because they had been made watchful by a wound he didn't know he owned. Fear became a grammar. He stopped trusting reflections. His phone, when left on the counter, gathered images of empty rooms, with one corner darker than the rest. The hand paused and made a shape in the air, as if drawing letters between frames. They flicked too fast to read, but left behind residue, a pattern like teeth marks. He called in sick and did not tell his classes where he'd gone. He walked through the city with a sense of someone following his shadow, and found that sometimes the follow was literal, a figure on the subway platform that matched his gait but dissolved if he turned. He visited the park at dusk and found a bench with gum and birdseed and a child's scarf knotted around the back. Someone had left him a toy train on the grass, a token from the time he had been accused of leaving. The train was painted blue and chipped. When he picked it up, the sky folded in a way that suggested change. That night, the apartment went quiet enough to hear the earth turning. The shadows gathered in the hallway and did something new. They waited at the door as if waiting for permission. Jonah understood then that the watching had a purpose beyond observation. It kept a ledger. It collected attendance. The voice that had once been the radiator sighed. "You reopen doors." He thought of all the doors he'd left ajar in his life. Promises carelessly given. Memories he had not closed. If the shadows were made by those daps, perhaps they could be unmade. He set about a ragged ritual. He gathered photos of faces he loved and burned them in the sink, the symbolic violence of erasure. He spoke aloud the names that had been on the outlines under his mattress and apologized to empty rooms. He taped his own name to the mirror and said, "I'm here now. I'm here." He tried to show the house he was no longer going to leave. The climax arrived with a weather system that seemed to move the sky like a curtain. Rain hammered the windows and turned the city into a single, continuous sound. The shadows poured through the seams of the building and stacked themselves like cordwood. In the hallway, a black tide. Jonah stood in the middle of his apartment, holding the blue train like a primitive scepter. The largest shadow detached itself and took on the wrong angles of a man. It wore his posture like a costume and said in a voice that was all the little voices layered together, "You can name us or we will name you." He realized then that the watching had been a contract he had signed out of neglect. The shadows wanted not to be seen but to be acknowledged. They wanted someone responsible enough to hold them. They wanted a memory, and memory is a kind of food. Jonah felt the room tilt. The shadows advanced not like predators but like creditors. He did the thing that felt monstrous and necessary. He offered them something real. He knelt and placed the train on the floor and spoke with a voice that was both apology and command. "I'm sorry," he said to every absence he had ever created. "I am here. You don't need to watch." He made a list, fast and ragged, of the faces in his head and spoke each name like a promise. They came forward and touched the train, 1,000 cool fingertips, and for a breath the room unfroze. The shadow that mimicked his shape bowed its head, and in that instant Jonah saw not malice but hunger and relief. The watching softened. The edges of the room brightened as if someone had unlatched a window. He thought for a crazy, hopeful second that he had solved it. Then the train moved on its own. It rolled slowly across the floor toward the hallway and stopped at the seam where plaster met doorframe. The shadows pressed into it until they seemed to fold into the plastic and the wood. The largest of them looked at him with the tilt of his own chin and said, with his mouth and with nobody's mouth at all, "Watch what you make." He understood too late that the truce was not mercy, but a recalibration. The shadows did not vanish, they redistributed. They entered the city like spores, and threaded into people like old songs, homes and alleys and arguments, waiting for the smallest neglect to blossom. They were patient and immortal, and once fed, did not forget the taste of being kept. He left the apartment that night before dawn and did not return. He moved to a different neighborhood, to a place of fluorescent light and small, infuriating honesty. He told himself that distance was exile and distance might be protection. Sometimes in the dark, when the world was quiet, he would find himself counting corners. He would see a darker patch of his own shadow and feel the tiny attention, as if something were remembering a debt. He would reach into his pocket and find a small blue train, cold and smooth between his fingers, as if proof had been left by a thing that wants to be known. On a rainy afternoon, months later, he found a postcard slid under his door. The handwriting, blocky and patient, read, "The shadows that watch." Below, a single line. The note smelled faintly of earth and orange peel. Jonah pressed his palm to it until the paper dampened, and thought of all the doors he had not yet closed. He folded the card and placed it in a box with the photographs he had burned, and the scraps of apologies he kept for emergencies. When the lights went out that night, it was not because the city failed, but because he had failed. In the dark, something leaned against the window and breathed his name with the softness of something that had been given a home. He did not look up, because some things, once watched, begin to watch back with the thoroughness of the weather.